Good morning, viewers by USA time, and good evening, viewers by Indian time. Welcome to Security Leadership Webinar. It is my pleasure and privilege to welcome Mr. Ernie Hayden to the webinar organized by International Council of Industrial Security and Safety Management. He was ICISS Country Councillor for Canada before shifting base to USA. He is US veteran and astute risk consultant, an author and a speaker. He is a security professional with extensive experience in the power utility industry, critical infrastructure protection, information security domain, industrial security controls, cyber security, and cyber warfare areas. ASIS International has chosen Ernie Hayden's new book, Critical Infrastructure Risk Assessment, The Definitive Threat Identification and Threat Reduction Handbook as the ASIS 2021 Security Book of the Year out of 17 books. Let's dwell on the subject of your book. And I would know that my viewers would love to get information and explanation from you on what is critical infrastructure. Has it been actually defined somewhere in law books? So over to you, Arnie.
Okay, well, thank you, Captain, and thank you very much for this opportunity. And I've been a champion of your organization for years. Like you said, I was the regional representative for Canada for a while until I resorted back to the United States. But it's always been an honor, and I continue to appreciate our connectivity. I think it's a good question about the definition of critical infrastructure. I want to offer two definitions first that you might find interesting, and then we'll go from there. So the first one, and I'm going to read it, so I'm sorry, but it's from the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And they define critical infrastructure as the physical and cyber systems and assets that are so vital to the United States that their incapacity or destruction would have a debilitating impact on our physical or economic security or public health or safety. The nation's critical infrastructure provides the essential services that underpin American society. So that's the definition from DHS. But when I wrote my book, I found a gentleman's quote that I actually thought was even so much easier for the layman to understand. And he said, infrastructure is everything you don't think about. The roads you drive on, the rigs and refineries that turn fossil fuel into gas that makes your car go, the electricity that powers the streetlights and lamps that guide your way. All these technologies vanish into the oblivion of normalcy. And I think number one is infrastructure is ubiquitous. It's everywhere. Critical infrastructure is quite profound because it really affects whether or not you're going to be able to get to work tomorrow, or you're going to be able to use the internet, or you're going to be able to go to a hospital. So critical infrastructure is quite good. Now, as a comment, I went ahead and when I was writing my book, I also studied the definition of critical infrastructure for other countries, including Netherlands, the EU, etc. And each country may have had a slightly different take on it, but generally speaking, it was pretty consistent with the US definition.
Fine. So it is defined what is critical infrastructure. And in fact, I have been throughout my professional career working in the critical infrastructure. Having understood, for the benefit of myself, I revised my knowledge through you. For the benefit of our viewers, we have understood now what is critical infrastructure. But then how risk assessment is required for critical infrastructure, how this may impact on security. effective security for that matter.
Okay. Well, first of all, I think it's risk assessment. Why in the world did I even want to talk about risk assessment and critical infrastructure? So in my career, I've been doing risk assessments at critical infrastructure probably since, it's easiest way to take a look at it was probably since around 1985, 86 time period. So it's been quite a few years. And specifically, I started doing risk assessments at nuclear power plants, not only in the United States, but also overseas in Taiwan and South Korea. And the whole concept of the risk assessment was to take a good hard look at the operation and physical plant for these nuclear plants and look for threats and vulnerabilities. Because if you look at the classic equation for a risk, it's threat times vulnerability times consequence is risk. So when we go into a plant, we would look for threats, vulnerabilities, and then take a hard look as to what the consequences could be if these two combined. But that's a risk assessment. Now, I think one of your pre-questions that you'd asked, which I thought was a great one, was the difference between a risk assessment and a security survey. To be frank, I never thought of that. So I did a little homework yesterday, just taking a look at the terms. And I think a security survey is more like you're going and looking at physical security issues. Is the barbed wire in place? Are the doors locked? Are the guards in place, and so on? Whereas a risk assessment that includes that, but also could include cyber. It could include cultural issues. For example, is the culture of the operation one that wants people to be risk adverse? Is there a risk appetite for the culture, for the management? So I might be rambling a little bit, but I want to try and explain that.
Ernie, a question will come little later. At this stage, we have understood what is critical infrastructure and what is risk assessment related to each other. In fact, one is a very essential requirement of good security is that you conduct risk assessment. So tell us more about your book.
Okay. Well, first of all, let's talk about why I even wrote the book. It's I'm getting ready to retire in theory, but just like you, Captain, will probably never retire. It's just there's always something to be done. And I was about getting to be 65 years old, and I thought, I really want to capture all the lessons learned that I've had over the years and try and put together a book on how to do a risk assessment. Now, the reason why I'm saying that is that there really isn't, I couldn't find anything that said, here's your recipe for doing a risk assessment. There are a variety of books and documents that talk about it, but nothing really comprehensive. And so I essentially just took and made a flow chart, which is in my book, and starting from the very beginning, all the way through the risk assessment to the documentation to how to close out your findings and so forth. And it was really a letter to the industry. It was my way of saying, thank you for all the great years you've given me and the good money that I've earned. And here it is. So that was why I wrote the book. And again, it was to fill a gap, because if you go up to your junior engineers and say, go out and do a risk assessment, they won't really know how to do that. I mean, they haven't been formally trained in it. They probably don't have a sense of how to proceed, where to start. And the intent, again, was to give them a tool or a toolkit on how to do that. So, so that's where the book came from. The book itself is really into basically 2 or 3 sections. The first section is the theory part, where I talk about, I have a whole chapter devoted to critical infrastructure. What is it? The definition, the history in the United States as to how they started with certain approaches under different presidents, such as President Clinton, President Bush, President Obama. And then also there's other elements that are really pretty much the derivatives of critical infrastructure for the United States. But then I said, this is not unique to the US. This is a global issue. So I looked at Canada, I looked at the European Union, I looked at the Netherlands, I looked at Japan, and there were some countries where it was pretty quiet. There was hardly anything written. And there were some countries where it was quite good. In fact, the Netherlands had some very interesting approaches to critical infrastructure security that just a little more unique and broader than, say, in the US. For instance, in the UK, the British include space as a critical infrastructure, whereas the United States doesn't address that. I thought that was pretty interesting because if you think about it, with space being a critical infrastructure, we have satellites, our ATMs run from satellites. So if I were to lose space, so to speak, which is a big thing to fathom, then we might lose our access to our ATMs for our money. So that's just another example. Anyway, that's the first section. The next section was pretty much a chapter on for each phase of the approach. So I have a chapter on how to prepare for the assessment, 2 chapters on performing the assessment, a chapter on writing up your results, and then a chapter on how to essentially respond to the findings from the assessment. And then the last section is basically an example of a report. And what I did is my publisher and I talked about this, and he said, it would be good for the reader to see what your product looks like. So I went ahead and took a whole series of reports I'd written, went ahead and made sure that they were anonymized appropriately, and then built a report. So if you go to the appendix and you say, what does this thing look like? There it is. One more thing I want to add in this section is that in the actual report itself, performance of the on-site, I have a whole chapter which I write about called the observation. And there's a technique that I learned many, many years ago where you basically go out to do your work. And every time you go to do something, it's like a chunk or a phase, and you do an observation. So for example, I watch people do work in the field, or I watch a guard perform their work or do their rounds and so forth. I write up an observation on that. I document it. Essentially, it's a notepad. I do that for every one of my observations. And then as I get ready to start writing my report, I have this stack of these observations that I can start building good practices, findings, any other key issues to be pursued. And it's just a way of making sure that it's documented, because my mind's not big enough to collect all this stuff and keep it. And if you have a team of, say, 10 people, all these observations coming together is a great way to start seeing overlap, common issues, extraneous issues, and so forth. So it's the observation chapter was one that I actually enjoyed writing because I'm not too familiar with many people that do it. And I was trained in that years ago when I worked at an organization in Atlanta called the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations.
Ernie, in fact, you have been very right that stage comes in professional career that makes you realize that this profession has given you a lot of name and fame and money also, and you reach that stage of realization that it is give back time to the same profession. And this is in fact the guiding theme of International Council of Industrial Security and Safety Management. And we focus only about sharing the information, sharing the knowledge, exchanging the experiences. You have been very thoughtful where you gave samples in your book. You have been very thoughtful, being yourself security practitioner of high repute and fame, that learning from the profession you want to transfer to younger generation. And I am sure that your book is going to be same kind of book important for those who start their career. And this point where you mentioned that risk assessment is essential for any project. The question is whether it should be done before the project is commissioned or it is to be done after commissioning of the project.
Ah, great question. Um, I'm first of all, I don't know about the fame part, Captain, but thanks anyway. I'll take credit for it. Um, the That's a great question. In my mind, a risk assessment is perpetual. You're always doing it. And I'll give you an example. Let's say, for example, we'll use your pipeline example. So I'm getting ready to build a new pipeline from point A to point B. If I'm doing that long before I draw a single line on a drawing or CAD drawing or whatever, or start buying components or designing in the, compressors and so forth, what I need to do is take a good hard look at what the risks are for that project from the very beginning and essentially start. You're familiar with the term risk register. I know you are. So what you do is you keep your risk register, but your risk assessment is always feeding that. Then you're hopefully capturing lessons learned as you proceed with the project. And again, but a risk assessment is holistic. It's bigger than just, what kind of material I'm going to use for the pipe. It's also going to be, well, am I going through a particular area that's prone to, for example, political issues or any kind of hostilities, or what about environmental impacts and so forth. So essentially, I guess I'm saying is that the risk assessment starts at the beginning and it's carried all the way through. Now, let's say, for example, we've done the project and we're getting ready to start the build, then what I would recommend is a formal risk assessment right there on the spot and say, okay, let's stop. Let's do a formal risk assessment on the design, all the plans and so forth. Maybe literally go out in the field and walk down the areas where the pipeline's going to be built, so you can make absolutely sure that you've captured what you see as the risks, the vulnerabilities, the threats are, and then make sure they're addressed for mitigation as you start the build. Then again, another phase where I would do a risk assessment is after we're done, just do one more design review, one more final walk down, one more final verification before you start filling up the line with the gas or the oil or the water. And then I would argue too that maybe having a mindset of an annual risk assessment just to take a good hard look would be worthwhile, or do periodic assessments of different systems. One idea that I'm very strongly advocate in the US is that you can do risk assessments, mini risk assessments on different processes or systems at your power plant or in your transmission system or whatever, just to make sure that you're, you know, keeping up to speed as what your threats and vulnerabilities are, but you're also not overwhelming yourself at the end with 500 findings that you'll never address. You can only address maybe 20. So it's a continuous process, and it's also one that I'd recommend you think about how you're going to eat the elephant.
But then, as wise people say, if your beginning is correct, subsequent steps you take very proudly and very confidently. So, beginning is a risk assessment done at blueprint stage. How do you expand this idea further? That risk assessment must be done and very professionally, very elaborately, very diligently before project is finalized. It is
Well, I
part
think
of
that
it is part of due diligence. Risk assessment is part of project planning and approval.
absolutely, absolutely. It's probably never been defined as an element in the project. Uh, I think that would be a nice idea. Maybe that'd be perhaps my legacy is that people would say, let's do a risk assessment according to Hayden's book for this design review and for this section of the project and so forth. I know on the cybersecurity side, it's been pounded in for years is that always to do the cyber security analysis before you start to build, before you go out and implement the code. And this is the same concept, except this is much more holistic. I think it's a good question. How do we advocate that? Well, maybe part of it is we start with the younger people who are going through their MBA programs and their management programs, new junior engineers coming out of university, maybe have a course on risk and risk assessments. I mean, wouldn't that be great to have that so that the graduate engineer comes out, they're really smart technically, but then you can also say to them, do a risk assessment, or what risks do you see in this approach that we're taking? That would be fantastic.
In fact, I am reminded of two situations about 10 years apart. Being in the company for long enough, you know your adversaries much better than your friends. So I worked in a company for more than 30 years, and I have seen company growing from beginning till it became mega major gas issue public sector undertaking in India and in Asia also. One project was being planned, and I gave my input that creating green area around the project is not a good idea. Keep it separate. Environmental issues need to be addressed. They must be understood and complied with. But keeping green area around the project is not a good idea, and it will have adverse impact on observation and patrolling and all that related issues. Management did not listen. After 10 years, they had big problem, though intermittently I kept on drawing attention. After 10 years, management realized that it is big problem. Now you can't cut the grown up trees. So they started working out the way around it, and they were forced to create another perimeter boundary wall and keeping this green area away from main project area. So that is one thing that you keep on fighting and tell that retrofitting is always very expensive and very difficult. Not everything can be retrofitted. So having risk assessment done before project is finalized is good idea. Management must be sensitive to this, and interaction and suggestions by you and other professionals make management realize what need to be done in such cases. Point is that risk assessment, you said that it is continuous process, but then how you keep on doing it? This is exercise which cannot be done every day.
Oh, no, no.
No.
I, but I would think that here's my mindset, and but also I'll go back to an example that I know we can all relate to. Um, think about where you work or how you commute or whatever, and you might see the same problem over and over and over again. And after a while, you're desensitized to it. You no longer see that as a problem because you just walk by it. You just drive by it. And I've been to power plants and to chemical factories where I come in with a very fresh set of eyes, and I look and I see issues that people have said, oh, I never saw that, or you're right, I remember seeing that, but I've forgotten, and so forth. So the continuous risk assessment is one where you're always asking yourself, is this a problem? Why is it a problem? What are the consequences if we don't fix this? I mean, I was, just to give you a very exaggerated example, I was at a power plant in overseas in Asia, and I was walking through the main turbine hall, and there was a leak coming from a pipe that was probably on the order of 10, 15 liters a minute. I mean, it was a lot of water coming out. And they had done a nice job of putting in a barrier around the floor area where it was wet so no one would slip and fall. But then my question to the plant operator was, well, what are you doing about that? And the answer is, well, we might get to it at our next outage. Well, as you dig into that, you ask questions like, show me your work orders, show me your spare parts, show me how you're all set to go once the plant shuts down, that you can fix this. And that's kind of like a mini risk assessment. And the answer was, when we shut down, we'll work on it. So it's kind of like a proactive approach rather than just a reactive approach. The other thing I want to say is that you're absolutely right. You cannot do risk assessments freshly all the time because you work in that space, you're always in there. So maybe what I was thinking is, and I hadn't thought about this, maybe this is my next book, I don't know, is how to rotate your risk assessors through the corporation so that you're, say, taking people and having them do risk assessments to give them more orientation to the company, but also give a fresh perspective on what the issues might be. It's just a thought.
So, being proactive is good policy, but being reactive is sometimes very desirable. We have in 5 6 days we have been talking about drones threats to critical infrastructure and also defense assets. This was not perceived as a threat in the way it has actually happened. So one needs to be reactive now because what they were thinking and in proactive manner they thought and put certain measures in place. Now something has happened, so it needs to be reactive. But then reactive mode also demands faster response and very quick establishment of reaction mechanism.
I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying because it's almost like I could hear an executive saying, I'm not going to do a risk assessment because it costs too much, it's a waste of time, and I'll never solve the problem. Well, wait a minute, first of all, are you even aware of how deep the problems are? And then secondly, you're right about costs, you're right about expenses, you're right about time. And it's just like as I do, it's a balance. So for instance, if I know there's a problem, I'm not going to do a formal risk assessment, document it, and then have it highlighted before I fix the problem. I mean, that's especially if it's a dangerous item. Someone could get killed or injured, or the plant could have a major leak, or environmental issue, or there's headlines in the newspaper. You're going to have to balance that. But I think there's a theme I've had for years as a security professional, and it started out when I was in my cyber side, where it was like you want the company management to have a security conscience, is what I use. I use that as a phrase. And I think it's the same as a risk conscience. Just think about what the risks are before you flippantly say it's not a problem, or you say, okay, let's see what we can do to fix it. I think that's part of my advocacy is and again, you don't need a formal risk assessment to do this. I mean, that's not the intent of the book, but the intent of the book is if I have to do a risk assessment, here's how I do it. I mean, this is a process. So I hope I'm answering the question.
Thank you very much. You have been very, very thorough in response. You know how director of finance or CFO of a company is always preoccupied with the budget, with the expenditure, and every risk assessment will cost money.
Mhm.
And invariable question would be how it is giving return on our investment, the expenditure on risk assessment, how one can show the evidence that it is actually beneficial.
Yeah, and that's always going to be a challenge because it's like the return on investment. Okay, what's the return on investment for doing a risk assessment? Well, what are the avoided costs? I mean, for instance, let's say I do a risk assessment, I identify an issue that could lead to an environmental problem that might result in thousands or millions of dollars of fines or negative publicity. Um, that risk assessment may have prevented me from spending that money, or at least I'm more prepared for it. Um, but there's no way you can guarantee that. I mean, I can think of risk assessments that I've done where I always find something. That's never an issue, but it's just a matter of was it a critical problem or was it just a minor issue that needs attention? Um, Now I want to go back to costs though. If you take a look at for a trained risk assessment or risk assessor, sure, you got to pay for the training up front. You got to, get them practiced at it. But after a while, I don't think it's that expensive. It's maybe one or two people who are using it's like quality assurance. You're basically having people do the work that you're going to pay for in some respects anyway, whether you're paying for it at the back end because you're fixing the mistakes that were missed, or you're paying for it up front so that you can at least be prepared for failures and so forth. So I don't think I'm thinking about all the risk assessments I've been involved in, and I just don't have a gut feeling that they were that expensive from the standpoint of doing the work. What was expensive was fixing the problems.
That is going to be big challenge for security professionals to get the approval of budget from the management. And in fact, early in my career, when annual confidential reports were to be written, there was a column in which I was supposed to give the evidence of my achievement. Now, there's a big problem. I am so damn good that nothing has happened. No breach of security. But I've got nothing to show. So when people ask, I know in senior management they are having their fixation on expenditure. So they till I retired, they kept on asking me repeatedly every presentation I made, what is this and what is return on investment? And I used to tell that compared two situations, cost of having security and cost of having no security or poor security. So you make your own decision, and good security costs money. That was situation. You also mentioned very clearly that unfortunately security professionals are in a field where they actually at the end of the year have nothing to show as proof of their being so competent and so good. But then again, that is the way things are going to be. I don't see, management would change the attitude so fast, even when it is so advanced, so far as industry and the growth is concerned. Your book on risk assessment comes handy. At least now, security professionals know how to argue their case. So you touch upon those, areas which are indication of certain functions being so essential, so critical that they cannot be overlooked, neglected, and security professionals need to be supported to take care of those issues. So your book is, I'm sure, going to be very helpful for not only budding security professionals, for seasoned professional, uh, for various reasons. I find that this I have actually, for my viewers, it is available on Amazon, and in Indian currency, it costs 5,000 rupees something, and it is something which you can save, retrieve, use it, because it is not in physical form, right? So I have now two quick questions. One question is, though it is late, question is, what is the actual difference between security survey and risk assessment? You have already answered in the beginning, but it was little, elementary. Let's get into the major difference between these two.
Mhm. Well, again, I think, as I alluded to earlier, I'm not familiar with the term security survey. In fact, I think there's been books written about security surveys. For ASIS has some books. But in my background, in my profession, I've never been told to do a security survey. I've been told to do a risk assessment, and I think that's why I was just using that as a embedded, uh, imbued term of art for me. So, but in my mind, when I look at the difference, for example, if I hire a military or paramilitary or police officer to do a security survey, they're going to look at security from the standpoint of, physical security, barriers, response time, detection, and so forth, all the kind of the classic things. But when I do a risk assessment, that's inclusive, but it's a little bit broader. For instance, when I look at card readers, for instance, or if I look at perimeter detection or building controls or whatever, I look at the cyber aspect too. For example, if they happen to have a really solid card reader system, but the password is on a yellow sticky attached to the monitor where I go ahead and log in the new key cards, that's a problem. That may not be detected by a security survey. I don't know.
Thank you, Ernie. It has been a good discussion, and I am very confident that viewers will draw immense benefit out of this interaction and also from your book. It is already, declared best book of the year 2021. I wish you and your countrymen a safe and healthy times ahead. Keep safe, keep healthy, keep smiling. You are doing a good job, and I am sure that we will have further interaction in coming times. Till
Well,
then,
if I ever get to India, I'm happy to be there and sign everybody's book. So thank you.